Thrilled to be joined here by our all-star panel. On my right, ironically,
should be on the left.
He should be on the left, is former Labour advisor Darren Barnett. And we've also got National Senator Matt Canavan. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this evening here in the middle of this King's birthday weekend. Now, I want to talk, a little bit of serious stuff. We've got a lot of fun stuff to talk about, but we do have to talk a bit about policy, where things are going to wind up landing out of the whole election, which we were just talking about off air. One story that has been catching my eye here is this talk about tax reform, because we've heard an awful lot about what's going to happen with this super tax. Now, James Paterson today, who I mentioned earlier in the program, he was also talking about tax reform and what might get the coalition to come to the table. Have a look at this.
If the Albanese government and the Treasurer Jim Chalmers were talking about genuine tax reform, holistic tax reform across the board, that, for example, reduced the collection of taxes in inefficient areas and collected that revenue in less distortionary ways, we'd be up for that conversation. We'd be happy to sit down and have that. But that's not what this is.
Matt Canavan, I want to throw to you first on this one here. I mean, I think it's good to see that the coalition is starting to get its act together in terms of policy. We won't have the discussion about where those policies were before the election just now. But, just to take this principle further, Matt, what are your thoughts on this idea that, well, the coalition can actually work with the government on tax reform if there's something positive to come out of it? Because we know there's been a lot of tax reviews and recommendations by the Henry Review, the Productivity Commission over years, but we've never been able to get it. Is there a sense that maybe, possibly, you could get some tax reform eventually in this country again?
Well, I perhaps wouldn't be holding my breath just yet, James. It's been a long time since we've done really fundamental tax reform in this country. We have done it before, of course, and the GST was introduced in the 1990s. That stood the test of time, and Tony Abbott did launch a tax white paper, but unfortunately that was ended early when Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister, and there hasn't really been a serious attempt at it since. I suppose you could say the mining tax was an example, but that was a tax increase, and I would draw that distinction. I don't believe tax reform amounts to tax increases. That's what this super tax does. It's an increase in tax to people. Some people like to then co-opt the word reform to hide the fact that it's actually a tax increase. But what we'd be serious about looking at is a more efficient tax system, not a higher burden on the Australian people tax system. And if I could just float one idea that I've been banging on for some time, I do think our tax system should be made more family friendly. Too often we do focus on tax reform just about the economy and GDP and productivity, and all those things are important, but the most important thing in your life, or my life, and I think most people's lives, are their children. And we don't have a tax system that really encourages people to spend more time with their children, especially in the way we punish single income families who want to look after especially young children in their early years, which is so important for their formation.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, I think you're talking about income splitting or something sort of along those lines, but
something like that.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, and a lot of countries do that. The United States, you can do that. And, Darren, let me throw this to you. From the Labour perspective, the thing that I've found really strange about this whole super tax debate, which keeps going on and on, is, again, there's a long Labour history of tax reform making the system more efficient. Paul Keating was great at that. This tax seems to be, as Matt says, just about raising more tax and more revenue. But also, it's so small, it's so nugatory, and it'd be sort of like the minerals resource rent tax, I'm sure, which barely raised a thing before it was axed. Why is it so important? Why has this become the die-in-the-ditch issue, particularly for Jim Chalmers?
I'm not sure that it was ever intended to be, and the evidence of that is that it wasn't a big issue in the election campaign. It's become a big issue now because there's not a lot else to talk about.
But they tried to get this tax through in the last Parliament, and then there was a lot of controversy around it, and then they left it sort of to fall by the wayside.
But they didn't take it off the table, and I'm really surprised, genuinely surprised, this was not something that the coalition campaigned on heavily during the election campaign. They got stuck on other things. This is a debate that we should have been having during the 5 weeks before people voted, not now. And I'm really surprised that we didn't.
Well, I mean, Matt, what do you say to that? I mean, why wasn't there more talk about this during the campaign?
It's a bit late now, isn't it? I think Darren's advice is good, but I can't do much with it. It's done now, so that's that. I think what happened was Darren did mention it was put forward in the last Parliament, and it was fairly resoundingly dismissed by the crossbench, the Senate crossbench. I don't think any of the crossbenchers ended up supporting it from memory. The Greens had a tougher plan that they didn't support the government either. And I think because it got defeated so resoundingly, it sort of went off the agenda, like this is not going to happen potentially. No one perhaps was forecasting that the Senate would change so much as it has at the election, given our lacklustre result, the coalition's lacklustre result. So now that the government has the numbers with the Greens, as I said, which was not an expected outcome, the threat of this super tax has grown since the election. I think that explains why it's come back into the debate so strongly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I also just think there's a general principle in there that people are just generally scared about, because once you do this, God knows what comes next.